to our latest webinar. I think on a fairly positive topic this morning, actually looking to see where we might be going on planning our return to the office or the workspace. But it's going to need a lot of planning, and hopefully this morning's webinar will help you with that. I am very fortunate to be joined this morning, well, not physically joined, but by technology, with Dr. Simon Joyston-Bechal, who, as I'm sure you're aware, because he's been on our webinars before, is one of the UK's leading health and safety lawyers. He's a director at Turnstone Law and previously qualified as a doctor, so I think very, very useful person to have on this topic. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to let Simon speak first, and then I'm going to do the second section of the webinar, looking a little bit more of the practicalities. If you have any questions as we go through, if you pop them in the panel on the right-hand side under the questions, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, we will be recording this. We are recording this, and so you can always pop back and listen to it. I'm also aware that both Simon and myself have produced some documents. I think Simon's is already available. Mine will be available next week to support this webinar, so I hope that will provide with further detail. So I think really, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon to tell us all about the legal aspects of this topic. Simon.
Thank you very much, Katharine, for that introduction. And you're doing my slides, aren't you? So we could push on with the slides.
I am indeed.
It's good to be doing something, I suppose, a little bit more positive after all the gloomy stuff we've been doing. At least there are ways back. So, what legal topics am I going to cover on the health and safety issues for returning to work after COVID? I'm going to talk about answering the question, what are your health and safety criminal law obligations? What do you actually have to do? In other words, what does the law expect you to do? I hope I'm going to answer the question, are health and safety criminal laws going to be enforced for COVID-19? And what needs to be considered in your return to work risk assessment is going to be something that I will cover, but also we'll discuss, both of us, I'm sure. And we've got time for Q&A, but we want people to post in their questions, please. I gather we've got about 900 people listening at the moment. So do send in your questions and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can. Right, let's push on. Next slide, please. So the first, just cover a few basics. Criminal health and safety law obligations. The first one to think about, Health and Safety at Work Act, sections 2 and 3. The duty to do everything, all steps that are reasonably practicable to safeguard employees and non-employees affected by your operations. And that must, in my view, include keeping up to date with COVID-19. You need to know what's going on, particularly relevant to your particular sector, but I think any employer needs to keep up to date with what's going on. And you need to do all planning and implementation, so far as reasonably practicable, for risk reduction measures. That's easy to say, but doing it is another matter. And I think I've particularly chosen those two words, planning and implementing, because planning is the sort of thing people are doing now, but what we've got to watch out for is implementing, and watch out for your plans not being achieved, which could put you in a weaker position than if you hadn't bothered to plan at all. And we may pick that up a bit later. Thanks. Let's move to the next legal obligation. Management of health and safety at work regulations. They create the duty to do a risk assessment. Specifically, risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient. Well, you've already got a whole variety of risk assessments. And these need to be in writing if you've got 5 or more employees. And there's a specific duty that your risk assessments must be reviewed and updated when circumstances change. And I think that's the particularly important point here. So many of your risk assessments across a whole host of issues need to be reviewed and updated because circumstances have changed with the virus and the returning to work. So that's quite a big piece of work. And really, it's part of what you need to do. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to go into every single risk assessment you've got and physically change what they say. But maybe you do. But maybe you need a suite of return to work risk assessments, which create variances to what's in the other risk assessments and method statements and plans. And I don't think there's any easy way to shortcut this process. It needs careful thought. It has to be suitable and sufficient. So if you're bringing people back to work after COVID in a very different circumstance to the norm, you really do need to think about this, plan it, and put it in writing if you've got 5 or more employees. That's quite an obligation, but I don't really see any shortcut to it. Katharine, do you share my view? There just isn't really a shortcut to the fact that you've got to just do the long miles on this stuff.
I think you do, and I think actually I've been working with various clients on this and finding actually going through the process and going, writing it down actually has helped the thinking as well and helped to sort of make sense of it. So I think it is a useful process as well as a necessary one.
Okay, right. Let's go to the next slide. The third bit of law that I just want to pick out is the personal protective equipment at work regulations. These, in particular with regard to PPE, there is a duty to provide suitable PPE. So that is, in other words, it's a criminal offence if you don't provide suitable PPE. And the PPE must be, and there's a list of characteristics here, appropriate for the risks and conditions, capable of fitting correctly, assessed, that means risk assessed effectively, as suitable and effective, so far as reasonably practicable to prevent or adequately control the risk. So think about the masks you're using, if you're going to use masks, deciding which type of masks, do they fit? Have you assessed whether they're suitable and effective for preventing spread of the virus one way or the other, i.e. in or out, taking into account the working conditions of your people? There is the so far as reasonably practicable, at least, for this assessment. They must be maintained, cleaned, and replaced as appropriate. So that replacement or replenishment of masks that have been used for more than however many hours they're allowed to be used for, that's written into the legislation. You need to give adequate information, instruction, and training. So you've got to tell people when to use the masks. And I think this is perhaps the hardest one, the last point. Take all reasonable steps to ensure PPE is properly used. Now, I think that could catch you if you're an employer who says, we want people to wear masks to do this kind of operation. And then the reality is that half your team don't bother with it. You then could be committing the criminal offence of breaching these regulations because you provided PPE, but you haven't taken reasonable steps to ensure it's properly used. So, and I think we need to be very cautious about a mismatch between our instructions and what actually happens. Next slide, please. So, what do you have to do? You've got to follow whatever the government rules are. I haven't given the details of the various COVID acts and regulations. That's the stuff that you've seen on in all the government guidance and what they're instructing people to do about who can go to work and who can't go to work. But there may be more rules and more relaxation steps specifically for your sector. So it's quite important that you follow those. But I'm specifically going to deal with health and safety law. You need to revise, renew, or create relevant risk assessments for COVID to deal with your return to work. In my view, there's no way around that. The plans, as always, have to identify hazards and set out the mitigation measures. Okay, next slide. This is an interesting question. Are health and safety criminal laws going to be enforced? Well, there are different ways of looking at this. The HSE website says we're going to take a flexible and proportionate account of the risks and challenges arising from the pandemic. So that's fair enough, but I don't really know how much that helps you or helps anyone. First of all, office work is enforced by the environmental health officers from local authorities, but I suppose they would always say the same thing. We're going to be flexible and proportionate. I'm sure they'd like to be, and in most cases they will want to be. But can you use that to assume that, oh, well, we're okay, everyone's in the same boat, so we're not going to be prosecuted? Because they can't prosecute everyone. Well, I'm sure you're right on that. They do have enforcement notices as well as prosecution, of course. They could serve improvement or prohibition notices or fee for intervention notices. At least that's the HSE can do that. I think you've got to be very careful about assuming that everyone is in the same boat, so you're not going to be prosecuted. I think you've got to consider the fears and anxieties of staff and their household members. And you've got to say to yourself, what if we get it wrong? What if we resume our operations really fast before we've done the adequate mitigation, before we've adequately risk assessed? So suppose you pressure people into returning to work and there isn't adequate social distancing at work or on the commute, and you haven't properly risk assessed and planned or provided PPE. And amongst those people in your workforce is someone whose anxiety levels are high, they're shielding someone at home, or they've got themselves a vulnerable health condition, and any of those people catch the virus, die from the virus, both of which things are not that unlikely to happen, you could easily imagine it happening, then you can imagine the blame if they say, well, we only caught it and my mother who's living with me at home only died because you pushed me back to work when I said I shouldn't come back to work. And when I got to work, you didn't give me safe conditions. Then you could see that could create a complaint to the HSE, the environmental health. And it may well be that if there's a number of complaints like that, there has to be some kind of action. So I think you've got to be very careful about assuming you won't get into trouble with the criminal law.
Simon, I believe I'm right in saying that it's actually, if you catch COVID-19 and it's deemed to be at work, it is now under RIDDOR, is it not?
Well, the RIDDOR question is another one that's rather tricky. It may be. There's an HSE guidance specifically about RIDDOR and COVID, and they give the example of a nurse or someone catching the disease in the workplace and having to report it. There's other people who've given opinions which says, but it can't be evidence. We can't be sure you caught it at work. And if we're not sure you caught it at work, why would we report it? And I'm not so sure it's that easy. And you could just imagine an employer who might normally trickle along with half a dozen RIDDOR reports a year, suddenly having 200 or 300 RIDDOR reports if they've got a big workforce, or even 1,000 RIDDOR reports, if they think maybe our workers caught it at work. It's a tricky one. I think it needs specifically to think about, and I'd be happy to advise on it. And my criticism of the HSE is that their guidance just deals with one end of the spectrum and says, within the healthcare setting, you ought to be reporting. But it doesn't answer the question, what if you're not in such a sensitive area? It's a good issue there. Anyway, so just rolling back, because I want to just, if I can, look at the next slide. So I'm looking at this point, which is, are you going to be prosecuted? And I want to say it's not that easy to think you're going to be safe. And I think it's quite interesting to look at the TUC, the trades unions, did quite an interesting report on returning to work. It was only a few days ago. And this is my quote of what I thought was an interesting part from the report. The HSE must act quickly to apply sanctions to employers that do not risk assess for COVID-19 or fail to provide safe working arrangements. So they specifically say apply sanctions. Employers must be made aware of the consequences of refusing or failing in their health and safety responsibilities, including prosecution and the forced closure of businesses. So in other words, the TUC there are giving a real call to arms. We've got to punish those businesses who ride roughshod over their workers and force them to come to work without adequate safety. Well, that's one view, of course, but we all need to be aware that that view is there. It's a reasoned view, and it's been set out and published. So I think it would be perhaps unsafe to assume you can't be prosecuted or punished in criminal law if you don't watch out for complying with those rules that I mentioned earlier. The risk assessing, written risk assessment, keeping it reviewed and updated, and all those things about thinking about your PPE. So let's look at the next slide. What needs to be considered in your return to work risk assessment? Well, of course, this depends on the sector, your workforce, your premises. I've said you must appreciate the worker anxiety, appreciate that some of the people will have much greater levels of anxiety than others. In fact, that's actually, I think perhaps part of the problem is that some of your workers will be completely blasé about this, and they'll resent the fact they have to wear masks, and if they put them on, they'll have their nose sticking out the top of them, and they'll be quite happy to get very close to other people in the workplace. And others of your workers will have extreme levels of anxiety, and you're going to get in trouble one way or the other, but you're particularly got to watch out, I think, for setting a rule and not enforcing the rule. So because the person who's more anxious can complain justifiably that because you didn't enforce the rules you created, you haven't given them, you've accepted what's required for safety, and yet you haven't done it. So watch out for that. In doing your risk assessment, you need to accommodate your workforce demographics and the individual vulnerabilities. Think about age, pregnancy, mental health, relevant illness. The latest thing, and I've read some of the latest data, and I find it, as a doctor as well as a lawyer, I find it quite confusing, the stuff about Black, Asian, and other ethnic groups, potential vulnerability both to catching and dying from this virus, because those figures are very mixed up. One doesn't quite know whether it's because of socioeconomic factors or because of some inherent vulnerability, physiological vulnerability. So, but I suspect a lot more is going to come out about that, and I think it's really important to keep it under review. But I don't quite know how, as an employer, you're going to deal with it. But it's certainly worth thinking about. Are we going to have to prioritize our return to work for people who are not in those groups? That would be quite a radical thing to think about doing. It would upset a lot of people. Really difficult area. All I can say at this stage is keep it under review and think about it, and keep it in your risk assessments. And I suppose liaise with your workers. And another issue which must, I think, form part of a return to work risk assessment, if it's going to adequately deal with individuals, is some kind of worker questionnaire where you're asking your workers, tell us or tick some boxes or send this Survey Monkey report back. Things like what's your level of anxiety about returning to work? Can you safely commute? What's your commuting method? Do you have any vulnerabilities? Are you shielding? Is someone in your household shielding? A whole host of questions. The difficulty is that some of those questions are sensitive questions, and they could even become personal medical questions. And you've then got to worry about how you deal with that sensitivity. Who should be asking those questions? Katharine and I were considering earlier, should it be HR who asks the questions? Should the line manager have visibility? So the line manager might be working out in my team of 20 people, who are going to be the first 5 that I'm going to bring back to work next month, once the government allows it or something. Yeah. So the line manager might want to see this questionnaire, but maybe they should get a distilled version or an anonymized version, or maybe there should be a points-based system where certain things in the questionnaire score points in order to prioritize who comes back or who gets the longest period not coming back. Katharine, what do you think about this? I think it's a really tricky one.
Yes, I think it is. And I think the way you couch the question, sometimes you don't have to gather such sensitive information. But I think for me, it's sort of HR, occupational health, those people that have got the the consent to gather information and have got the systems in place to protect it. That's where I would be looking for these people to be engaging with gathering that information.
But then we've got to watch out for at least 2 very hard bits of crunchy law. The first is medical confidentiality of questionnaire responses, and even if you've only asked, do you have one of those conditions that puts you on the vulnerable list, that may be enough to be actually you've obtained some confidential information that you need to be very careful about. And you could see that you may well have a comments box, and you may well pick up information which is sensitive medical confidential information. You've got to be very careful how you deal with that. Then the other issue is the data protection rights. This is the information you're collecting will be personal information, and you owe data protection obligations into how you process and distribute and deal with that information. And I suppose that feeds into whether you're going to anonymize it or whether you can anonymize it, whether it would work to anonymize it in groups. So say, for example, you had a group of people which was only 5 people, and you told the line manager that out of your 5 people, 3 of them have scored this and 1 of them has that. It may well be possible that although you're trying to keep it confidential, the line manager will know some information that maybe you don't want them to know. So it's a difficult one, and we need to work through it very carefully. Let's move on. So what needs to be considered in your return to work risk assessment? So I think, Katharine, you're going to talk about some of these in more detail. I mean, clearly workstation layout, the lifts, how many people in the lift, how many people in your canteen, these tight parts of the office. You see, it's easy to say, oh, we'll spread people out at their desks. But what about the tighter parts? Kitchens, toilets, copying rooms, ventilation you want to talk about, I think, Katharine. Signage, cleaning, you're going to increase your cleaning regime. What are the commuting options? Shared vehicles. So if being in a vehicle is part of the work and you want to send people out, you can't send them out one in a vehicle at a time, then there's shared vehicles, and I think that's a very difficult one, particularly like the police. You see them going around 2 in a vehicle sitting next to each other, and you wonder how they're doing it. Shift patterns and phased return. And then I think this is an important one, is the balance. I think it's too easy to get overhead up on the 2-meter separation rule. The 2 meter, as far as I can work out, is not in the law. It's a bit of guidance. It's not in the law. There isn't a law that says you must never employ people and put them less than 2 meters away from someone at somewhere else. I've covered the laws earlier on. But clearly you want to try and achieve 2 meter separation, but then it may be that you can't in certain circumstances. So if you can't, think of the other mitigation measures, such as PPE or barriers that might allow you to get below 2 meters and do it safely. Think also about the duration of the proximity. And there's a lot said about the 2 meters, but the evidence is very mixed. On the one hand, we've got this thing that says what you need to worry about is being within 2 meters of someone for 15 minutes or more. And on the other hand, you have the sort of fleeting terror of passing someone in a corridor for 2 seconds where you're within less than 2 meters of them. And the two must be very different. The two create a totally different virus load if you're passing someone who's infected. And I don't know where the real risk lies. I suspect it's somewhere between the 2 seconds and the 15 minutes, but I really don't know which end of the spectrum. But we need to take into account, and I don't think we should over-exaggerate the fear of a passing few seconds of exposure. And then I think the other thing to weigh into the balance is the necessity. Do we have to do it like this? Is there an alternative? And I guess if you're in the police, you're running the Metropolitan Police, you're going to say something like, well, look, we need 2 people in our vehicles for a variety of reasons, and so we don't really have an alternative, so that's what we're going to do. But for some of you, there will be a necessity type argument. And for others of you, or there may be alternatives to get around it. And I think that is part of it. It's depending on what you're doing. So, for example, if you're doing the checkout in Sainsbury's, there's a good necessity argument. You've got to get people, we've got to feed the nation. But then we've still got to work out what we can do by way of alternatives to do it more safely. Right, next slide. So, these are my concluding comments on the law, just to wrap up with a few little points. Watch out for inadequate planning. You could be blamed in the law if you don't plan properly. Watch out for poor documentation of your planning and your risk assessments and the balancing exercise. So if you've conducted a balancing exercise and concluded that because of our operations and the necessities, we are going to have certain circumstances where people are 1 meter away from each other, but we're going to mitigate it by balancing the duration and the fact that they're wearing masks but not complete respirator kits, then, and on balance, that is what we regard as being reasonably practicable, and that's our decision. You should record that in writing so that if you get blamed later on, you will be able to say, well, we did the balancing exercise, we did what we considered to be reasonably practicable. That document will make it much less likely you get prosecuted, and if you are prosecuted, it could form your defense. Watch out for employees being pressured into returning. That's always a hotspot. That's just more likely to generate complaints. Watch out for this thing. Yes, I'm very hot on this. You've got a social distancing rule, and then you don't enforce it. That's bound to get you into trouble. And watch out for replenishing your PPE and making sure it's adequate. I've got this question here, which I've been asked. Can you be reassured that it's going to be hard to prove that the infected workers contracted the virus in the workplace rather than elsewhere? So you might think, oh, it's okay, we don't have to worry, because if our employee's mother gets ill and dies from the virus, how are they possibly going to prove that they got ill in our workplace rather than on the commute or when they went out to the supermarket or whatever? So surely we can't be blamed. Well, that argument might help you in terms of civil compensation, but in criminal law, it won't help you. For most of these health and safety criminal laws, What matters is the exposure to risk. And if you've failed to do some of those things that I've mentioned, and therefore you've exposed people to risk and you've not complied with health and safety law, it can be cited against you as an illustration that so-and-so's mother died and might have caught it at work, but the prosecution doesn't need the proof that they caught it at work. The prosecution just needs the proof that you didn't do what you should have done and you exposed people to risk. So the reassurance that the evidence is going to be troublesome to mount against you is really a false reassurance. Katharine.
Right. Well, we're not going to stop for questions now because I'm going to say my piece, but we are collating the questions, so please feel free to put them in the box whilst I'm speaking. I'm going to carry on now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more on a practical thing on planning on return to the office. So this is my thought process really on the areas that we need to consider if we're going during this planning process. And I think it's all very interlinked. And for me, I think the starting point is going to be, what the business needs. From talking to clients of mine and colleagues, we've actually been quite surprised by how much good work is being done out of the office. And there does seem to be a feeling that why are we going to bring people back on site if actually there's no rush to do so? So I think we need to focus very much on what is not working as it stands at the moment, and focus on getting those folk and those activities back into the office first. So I think that's a really important part to sort of start our thought process. Once we know that, we then need to consider the employees' issues. As Simon clearly sort of pointed out, the various things we need to discuss, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But very much, who needs to be shielded, and what is the risk status of the employees if they were to return to work, and that includes their family environment and also their feelings about it. And then we have, when we actually get them back into the office, what is going on in this office workplace environment? How are we going to keep our social distancing, and how are we going to prevent this touch droplet spread? So that's where I think the basis of my thinking. So, if we look at the business needs, it's going to be different for all of us, which is why I think there's no set plan, and we're all going to be different. We've seen that this crisis has brought forward some changes in our work practices that perhaps we weren't sure was going to work, and now we find actually it works really very well. And so going forwards, we are going to see probably less travel. I certainly am going to be using remote systems far more than I ever have before. Being a bit of a Luddite, I found actually I can use them quite well. We're going to be seeing more remote meetings, and we are going to see people doing more agile working, I think, maybe a little bit from home, a little bit from other places. But can I just put a little caveat on that? Just because we have managed in the last sort of 6 weeks, doesn't mean to say that we don't need to overlook the social aspects. We are still going to need face-to-face. We are still going to need to make sure that people can see and be with their colleagues. And yes, we have coped really well, but that doesn't mean to say that's something we want to continue with if we don't need to. And I also, something close to my heart, when temporary becomes long-term and permanent, we need to make sure that we support that change. Again, we have coped, and as humans, we cope really well. But is it going to have a long-term effect? And obviously, I'm very concerned about people and their positions at their workstations. So what about the employee issues? What do we need to know? Well, these are the things that I think I would want to know, and I am certainly going to be talking to my colleagues about. Are they currently having to self-isolate, or whether it's for their issues or the dependents at home? What is their risk level? If we've got somebody who's vulnerable, we need to make sure that we don't cause that to be a concern. What is their current home working setup? Is it suitable? Is it being fine for now, but actually in the longer term, that's not such a good thing. So do we perhaps need to consider bringing them back because of that? What about employees who have particular needs that are usually very well accommodated, but the change in the environment has caused them more difficult concerns? I think we really have to make sure we include everybody in our thinking. Some of the more difficult ones, how do people actually come into our workplace? Public transport is going to be, I think, a crunch area. I've read numerous articles saying that, to keep the social distancing, there's going to be a lot of pressure. So we need to consider that, but also the fear factor, I think, of being on potentially crowded transport medium. Maybe we are going to allow people to come to work in their own vehicles, but how many of us have got enough car parking to do that? And then what about our individual, fear and our perception? I've actually had to come into the office today because my Wi-Fi connection has been really bad over the last couple of days. And, I felt very strange stepping outside of the house, even though I knew I was coming in my car to an environment where I was not going to be subjected to other people. I've got over it, but I think it will be very interesting for all of us. And I don't think we should not take that seriously. And then we come to the environment. I'm not going to go through all of these, so please don't worry. But these are all the areas that we need to really think closely about. I think, looking at workstation separation and barriers, maybe actually some of the simpler ones. What about toilet use? I mean, obviously I came in this morning and washed my hands and used the facilities, and I was very conscious of how many things I was touching and thinking, well, if there are other people in the office, how are we going to make sure that we don't have those problems? Lifts, we talked about, ventilation, waste disposal. What about, the first aid and fire warden provision, fire alarm, evacuations, PEEPs, those sorts of things? We really do need to be focusing on those. So we've talked a lot about risk assessment, and I want to bring us back to, once we've identified what risks we've got, and on my last slide you saw there were lots of potential areas, we've got to think how we're going to think about our controls. And I think we need to go back to this hierarchy of control that we use for all other risks. So obviously at the top of the triangle, the upside down triangle, we've got the best, the most effective options, which is elimination, which is what we've already been doing, is by isolating ourselves. Home working has been eliminating that risk, but that's not sustainable in the levels we've had so far. Moving down is substitution. I don't think that's really a relevant one that we can use in this situation. Engineering controls, that's when we start looking at our separation, or maybe our ventilation, maybe the filters in our ventilation, or when we have it on, or what sort of levels. Administration, our phased return, having some people working from home at some time and some not. Increased cleaning, looking at how people are going to behave, what policies and procedures are we going to do. And then finally at the bottom, which seems to have been such an important issue, but it is there as not a terribly effective way of control for many situations, is that PPE, the masks and gloves. And I think we have to be very careful. Remember that the PPE only really protects the wearer if it's used effectively. And yet we are talking about masks protecting others. So we're using them in a slightly different way, but we need to make sure that it doesn't have an impact on the individual. So I think we do need to use that hierarchy to help guide us. And we also need to remember what we're trying to do. And I've put some basics up here. we've all been told, we all know that it's a fast moving situation. It's a new virus. We don't have a lot of data. But I think these are some of the facts that we're working on at the moment. You know, we're worried about the transmission via respiratory droplets through sneezing and coughing and people interacting and inhaling those or getting them in the respiratory tract. It appears that the air can be up the air for about 3 hours, which is interesting. We've talked about, or we're aware that, you know, if people get droplets on their hands and then they put them on their face, this is a problem. And then we've seen that actually the virus can sit around on different medium for different lengths of time. So I think we need to be thinking clearly when we're looking at our control measures, remembering what we're trying to prevent.
Can I jump in here, Katharine?
Of course you can.
I don't disagree with anything you said, and of course everyone is trying to pull together whatever logical information they can about this. And I just want to make an observation about something that does rather worry me. We have to do the studies and know the answer to questions like, how long can a virus particle sit on a hard surface and then still be viable? You know, is it 1 day, 2 days, how many hours, what is it? Okay, we need to know those answers. But there's an awful lot of people who then make the leap to saying, okay, so because a virus particle, and I don't know if this is true, can survive on a park bench for 2 days, we must never sit on a park bench because we might catch it. Or we've got to wash our hands if we touch the park bench. Maybe that's true, but maybe it isn't, because there's another issue, which is, what is the infectious dose? And is the virus going to land up in your respiratory tract, your mouth, or the top of your throat? Is it going to land up there just because it's sitting on a park bench and there's 10 viable viruses? If the infectious dose, for the sake of argument, is you need to breathe in, and I have no idea what the figure is, 2,000 virus particles to create a viable infection that's going to make you ill, then it's silly just to know that you might, or to panic over picking up 10 virus particles. Or, for example, if someone coughs 3 meters away from you and they've got the bug, yes, it may well be true that half a dozen virus particles can reach you, but just because it can reach you doesn't mean you're going to get ill. Similarly with PPE, I think there's a huge conflation of the issues here. There's a whole lot of people who are obsessed with the fact that a mask doesn't completely stop virus particles going in or out. Absolutely true, and particularly when it's damp. Absolutely true, damp because of your breath. But that doesn't answer the question, what's the likelihood that a mask is going to reduce an exposure to below the level that could cause you to get ill? And so all of that conflated stuff, it's very easy to get very confused with it. And the government don't help with what they're putting out. I'll let you get on, Katharine. Sorry for that interruption.
I think that's very important. And I think almost like that last line sort of says, the virus will decline over time, and it may not always be sufficient numbers to cause infection. I think we must also remember that when we're coming back to work, all that stuff we were doing before we went into lockdown will remain, and we've probably all still got posters up in our work environments. So this good hygiene, social distancing, good practices that we were all doing before lockdown needs to continue. And again, when I've been in lockdown myself with the people that I've been living with, I actually don't think I've been as careful because I've been around them and none of us have been going out. So I'm going to have to reinvigorate this to make sure that I do keep up my hand washing in the same way that I did before I left the office environment. So looking at some very specifics, I'm not going to go into a lot of these simply because of time, but here are some thoughts, and I have put them in the document that we will be circulating, and we will I will have copies of these slides that will go on our website too. So just having a look at it, these are just some thoughts as to perhaps how we are looking at getting the distancing. You know, our meeting rooms, we need to look at the size of them and think, how many people might it be safe to have in here? Some of them may not be suitable at all, and we may say, well, actually, we may put that as a separate office for somebody who's more vulnerable. Canteen areas and social spaces, you know, how can we use those so allowing the distancing? For me, one of the difficult ones, how are we going to make our coffees? Now that one, I think I'm not sure I've really solved yet. But when you think how many, you know, they're using the fridges and that type of thing. So these are really interesting, difficult things that we need to sort of get our heads around. I think certainly getting rid of, you know, multi-use towels is a very good idea. Go for disposable towels, that sort of thing. But really needs some really clear thoughts.
It's a fantastic list you've created there.
There is quite a lot. There's quite a lot. I'm afraid there's more in my document, sadly. But you know, other environments, can we, you know, where we don't have fire doors, can we pop them open to stop having to touch? You know, do we need to have staggering starting and finishing times to save bunching up at doors? Making sure we have enough first aid and fire warden provision. That could be quite difficult with a smaller pool. So that's going to need a little bit of thought, as well as how we, you know, keep the other testing and other maintenance of our systems, our safety systems in place. You know, let's make sure that we don't overlook the evacuation plans of people who perhaps need a little bit more assistance. Lots of things to consider. The first aid provision we may already have in place from when we were aware of this virus before we left our workspaces. So some of these things may already be in place for you. A few other issues I just really wanted to bring up. Obviously, communication I think is absolutely key. You know, we're going to put in all these new policies and procedures. We need to communicate with people, and we need people to come along with us so they respect them and they work with us on it, and let us know when they're not working too. We are going to be needing to track and trace. So we need to know where people have been working, who they've been in contact with, because this has got to be part of the next strategy to keep our infection levels down. And so we need to decide who within the business is going to do that, I think. We've talked about people with particular needs and making sure that they're considered in our plans. Very easy to overlook these people, but their needs are just as valid as anybody else's. We're going to need to train people in these new procedures. We're going to have to think going forwards about visitors and contractors and our other field-based staff. I've not talked about those today because I've very much focused on an office environment, but we need to consider them and how they're going to interact with other people's processes. Little plea just to say, let's not forget those people who will continue to be working at home, either full-time or part-time. We focused on them recently. Now we're focusing on the office, but let's not forget the other members of staff. So really, I just want to sort of summarize to say this is a start of an ongoing longer process. Our risk assessments are going to evolve, and they're going to be a rolling program as we learn and we learn as our businesses. Communication is absolutely vital. We need employees to be engaged and compliant and coming up with ideas. I think we've all worked together. We've done a great job so far. And I really think that if we're all very aware, we can solve these things. You know, make sure our arrangements consider all staff and make sure that we consult to make sure that it is working for everyone. I found some fantastic information available from professional and trade bodies, and I'm going to try and put as many references as I can in the document, but I really would suggest you go out there and find there's some really good information and some really good ideas. And you know what? It's not up to the government, it's not up to businesses, it's up to every single one of us to make this work and keep our infection rates low, if we all look at ourselves and how we work and consider other people, we really can make this work, and we really can get back to work, I think, very safely. So really, at that point, I think it's time for any questions. And I know, Chris, you've been collating some questions. Do you want to find some interesting one for us?
Oh, well, Katharine, the choice is quite unbelievable. We've had an absolutely overwhelming number of questions today, and also number of attendees. So I'd just like to say that some of you may have colleagues that were unable to attend today. We have a 1,000 attendee limit, which we were hoping we were going to stay just underneath today, but we smashed it. So unfortunately, some of your colleagues will have received the message they weren't able to attend. But fear not, the webinar, as Katharine stated, is being recorded and will be available later today at posturite.co.uk/webinars and also on our YouTube channel. And we also publish the slides on our Posturite page as well, along with some answers to some of these questions. And as I say, we will next time, assuming that we're going to get a similar number of attendees, we will make arrangements for next time. We've got other technologies which we will experiment with, so bear with us, and sorry about today. So we have had a huge number of questions. We will definitely not be able to get through all of them, but I've tried my best to collate a number of them that seem relevant, and so I'll get going. So quite a few questions about just general information and where people should be going to get best information. So with a view of keeping up to date with COVID, where should people be going to get the sort of latest requirements, particularly thinking about people returning to site?
Simon, have you got any particular thoughts? Or
I found most sources to be completely hopeless, but Katharine, you picked up one or two things. The HSE, it's worth keeping abreast of that, and they may come up with things. But to be honest, Katharine, the first time I read something as comprehensive as the stuff in your slides was when I read your slides yesterday.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I have taken some things from the World Health Organization has put some good articles out. I have there's a very good recommendations from the European Heating and Ventilation Association. The fire officers, so I'm just trying to find the National Fire Chiefs Council put some very good information out. As I say, I will try and collate those and put them out there. But I think IOSH has done a very good webinar, and there's some good information on their site.
So
and the British Safety Council.
If we will, in our on the webinars page, if we put a number of links of where to find further information, it'd be fantastic. So if you can work with the marketing team,
let's pick up on that ventilation point, Katharine, because you raised that, and I was surprised. It hadn't occurred to me, but it's certainly a really important question you all have to ask, which is, what are our ventilation systems in the workplace? And are they potentially sucking up virus from one infected team and spewing it over a particularly hapless individual who's sitting under a ventilation outlet and receiving it? And should we reprogram our ventilation system so that we get it, because the ventilation system may have heating or chilling as part of what it does, and should we reprogram it so that we only recirculate air at times of day when people aren't in the workplace, and when people are in the workplace we change to bringing in the fresh air source, which we might not otherwise do? And there are various, or should we turn it down? There's a whole lot of things to think about.
Let me share with you a slide which I'd taken out because I was worried about time. But I will share that, and again, this will be available in the document. But this is actually something that was put out by that organisation, which people may find helpful. I'll leave it on the screen while we go for the next question.
It's good yeah, that's good.
Okay, next question, probably about risk assessments. A lot of questions about how they get started with risk assessments. Should they be shared widely within the organisation? how they should be stored, and if we've got any examples to get people started.
Oh, Simon, go for it.
Well, I think part of it, do you remember I said part of it was look at your existing risk assessments that are relevant and work out what needs to change. I think the other part of it is some people can be frightened by the word risk assessment. And if you call it something else, action plan for return to work vis-a-vis COVID, and with a column of hazards and mitigation measures, that will get you thinking along the right lines. And then effectively it turns into an instruction or method statement document, which is these are the things we're going to look at. Katharine's list of bullet points from her slides are going to also cover an awful lot of ground. So if you go through and think of all those things in Katharine's list, from ventilation to fire plans, first aid, doors, and all the rest of it, you're going to cover an awful lot of ground that will sort of start to write itself.
Yes,
if it was that easy.
if it is. But I actually think, should it be shared? I think absolutely it needs to be shared. And I think we have to, this discussion with people to say, these are our thoughts. Please let us know if it's not working. So yes, they do need to be shared. And I do absolutely agree with Simon. Let's not make it scary. Let's go for an action plan. These are what we found. This is what we're going to do about it. Let's keep it really pragmatic and simple language and show our working.
So following on from that, Katharine, sorry, Simon. I have a question for someone that has less than 5 employees, and their question is whether or not it's better or not to have a written risk assessment, because I think they're worried that if their risk assessment is not good enough, do they become more vulnerable than if they didn't have a risk assessment?
I don't think it's a good strategy to do less thinking because you'll get in trouble if you've done the thinking wrong. Similarly, I don't think it's a good strategy to put less in writing, because if we put it in writing, we may be blamed. I think if you can do it in writing, and if you can think about it, do so. And it's really about balancing. I see the risk assessment as it shouldn't be a document that's going to get you into trouble. If you've written it correctly, it's going to be a document that you'll be able to waive if you've got it wrong, to say, look, we did think about it. We did what was reasonably practicable. But as you could see, we struggled to balance this factor against that factor. And that's why we came down with a decision that we were going to do this and not going to do that. It's helpful to document it. But it isn't that easy, but it is. That's my view. It's going to help you push off a prosecution if you show you thought about it.
Yes, and I very much agree with that.
Excellent. So moving on to some more sort of practical questions about office use and shared offices. And fire doors, that's something that we've discussed before, Katharine. What should people be doing specifically with fire doors? They're obviously an easy touch point within an organisation, but what do we do with them?
Well, when we need to sort of check on our fire risk assessments, and if fire doors are there to protect, obviously life and limb, they do need to be respected. But we do then need to see, can we actually make sure that we've got cleaners and sanitizers there, so if people do need to go through them, that they're able to be wiped down. So I think, review the fire risk assessment, and if they need to be kept closed, they do need to be kept closed.
And the cleaning regime, so that your cleaners perhaps several times a day are going to go around with sanitizer, wiping down relevant door handles and lift buttons and things like that.
Yes, and I think actually there has been quite a lot of people who've been concerned about the working levels for cleaners. I think actually we all clean our own homes, and I think we could all take a little bit of responsibility for helping with the extra small cleaning that goes on in the office. But it does depend on the culture in your areas.
Brilliant, thanks both. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about taking temperatures as people come into buildings, but I don't think there's been anything to say what's the temperature reading that's the case for actually then turning somebody away from the building, and what action should happen if the temperature reading is too high.
Oh, I think that's Simon. That's a doctor question, that one.
I was thinking, I don't know how I can dodge that bullet. I think it's a really good observation. I don't know that I want to, as an employer, I don't know if I want to get into that, taking temperatures of my people as they come in and out. I don't find it very attractive.
Yeah, I think it is going to happen. I saw a program that they were thinking about doing it at airports and things like that. I think if it does happen, I think the question of what the temperature is, I think I would have to defer to the College of GPs or the Society of Rock Medicine or something. But if they are high, then
here's the point.
Self-isolate.
Well, here's the point, really. If you get difficult questions like that, you have a occupational health advisor, or the doctors that you use to advise the company. Those doctors should be asked that kind of question and see what they say. They should be asked questions. Is it worth using infrared thermometers to measure people's temperatures? If you think we should do it, what temperature to set our level? It means you're banned from the office.
Yeah, and I think
that's the person to ask.
Yeah, this will feed into the track and trace we'll need to do, because if somebody is exhibiting systems, we're hoping with the testing ramping up that maybe we'll be able to get them tested, and then if they do come back positive, we'll be tracking down those people they've come in contact with. So this will feed in possibly to some other systems that we're going to be doing on a more longer term basis.
I guess also the question of whether you do or whether you don't, it's fine when we're talking about a building that has got single occupancy of one company, but actually what measures need to be taken when we start looking at shared office space? So where you've got one multi-floor building with different companies resident in it, perhaps managed by a facilities company, what changes suddenly happen then?
Okay, that's a really good question. In fact, it's something we've been pondering. There's a whole lot of situations where two different employers meet on this. It could be that you've got contractors and your contractor's staff come into your building, or you are yourself a contractor and you send your staff to other people's buildings. There's multi-occupancy buildings. I think the answer in all cases is to liaise with the other employers, compare notes on risk assessments, and respect the other employers. So if you're in that multi-occupancy building, you'd want to know what the building landlord is planning for the common rules of expectations for the shared spaces. And you might want to encourage that landlord to tighten up if you think they're a bit lax, or equally, you might just say, okay, we'll follow your rules. We had a question which was, what about we send security guards out to people's offices, and the people we're sending them to insist on face masks, but we haven't been insisting on face masks. What should we do? Tricky question, but I think it's all about liaising sensitivity and risk assessing.
Excellent. So, what about first aiders? How do we protect our first aiders in the new world that we're entering into?
I think many people have already had sort of protection advice for first aiders before we went into lockdown, and I know again that St John's ambulances, St John's Ambs and the Red Cross have actually provided some very good guidance on this. I have to say it's not an area of my expertise, and I can't really quote on it, but I would signpost people to both St John's and the Red Cross.
Super. Okay, thanks. Right, Katharine, definitely one still in your wheelhouse. We touched on the sort of the advice from HSE about DSE regs at home a few weeks ago. Do you know if that's changed at all in that time? And what's our sort of current opinion on that and people working from home and the obligations that companies have got for their workforce?
Fine. I actually popped onto the HSE website yesterday. I had a question about this, and that the advice remains the same from the HSE that temporary workers, for a temporary basis, there's no need to do a full DSE assessment. But I would still come back and say, well, actually, we still have a duty of care. We need to make sure that people are managing effectively at home. But I think we're now moving into a phase where it's actually no longer so much temporary, it's getting to be more prolonged. And certainly anecdotally, we are beginning to see people creaking a little bit, who perhaps have managed to work at home in difficult setup environments, and are beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. So I would strongly advise people to review workstations if these are going to continue to be used on an ongoing basis. Mm-hmm. Because I think we are now going from temporary to something a little bit more longer in duration.
Yeah,
I agree with that. Very much agree with that.
Simon, one probably aimed more at you this time. If we've got an employee that prefers not to return to work and they're currently on furlough, what are the company's options? If the staff say no, what and others wish to return, what does a company do?
Well, I think that's a difficult area, but I think in doing your return to work planning and risk assessing, you do have to take into account your individual employees. Now, I don't think there's a legal obligation to weigh into the balance. One employee is keen to get back to work and another employee is not keen to get back to work. But I think there's an important pragmatic reason to do so, which is the one who's, well, first of all, there may be a reason why one is not keen, a genuine health and risk reason why one is not keen. But also, the likelihood you're going to get yourself into trouble means that if you possibly can, you should take into account the fact that some people, you push someone in when they don't want to come in, and it goes wrong, they're more likely to complain. And whether that means complain as in you get it in the neck because they complain to the HSE who prosecute you, or just complain and you've got unhappy workers and disgruntled workers. So I think you've got to take it into account in the real world, and particularly if what we're talking about is phased returning, it should be a factor in the mix. But I mean, the other factors are, as Katharine pointed out, how badly do we need people back at work? Some people are more essential to get back than others.
I think also this is where actually risk assessment can be really helpful. If your staff see that you're taking a really sensible, pragmatic and consultative view of making plans, they're going to be more confident in coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, switching a little bit and perhaps moving on to transport. The commute to work's not usually considered the responsibility of the business, but has that changed a bit? And is it now necessary to include that in the risk assessments?
Yes, that's a very good observation. So normally, Health and Safety at Work Act and other health and safety obligations apply to the workplace and the working day, and therefore do not apply to the commute to or from work. They would apply to traveling. Say you've got 2 offices, and halfway through the day, your employee needs to travel from office A to office B, and even if they do it in their own car, that is part of the work activity, but the journey to and from work is excluded. Nonetheless, I think that a suitable and sufficient COVID return to work risk assessment simply cannot ignore people's commute. It's part of the picture, and it's also part of whether they're going to bring virus into your workplace. So I just don't think you can ignore it. I think we have to consider commuting.
Yeah, and I think actually
as part of your legal obligation. I think that's the point I'm making. It's not technically normally your legal obligation. I think it becomes your legal obligation because it impacts safety of your workers in the workplace.
I also think it's part of our community responsibility as well.
So, and Simon, you talked about travelling between sites. So you've got cars going from one site to another as part of the business day. What about long haul business travel? I mean, I think we're in a world where we're not really considering that on day one as we begin to emerge from this, but it's going to become part of life at some point again. How does that change? What there are the risks that we're going to need to assess? Is there a different approach to risk assessments for long haul business travel?
I suppose that's going to be one where we take into account the relevant guidance from our government and the countries of the places we're sending business people to visit. So, for example, there may be a relaxation at some point. I mean, planes are still flying. There may be a relaxation at some point, which says travel for work, international travel for work is permitted so long as this is only where this is essential. So at that point, you're not necessarily going to be criticized for sending someone to your Mumbai office if it truly is essential. But if you are going to send someone to your Mumbai office, then you've still got to do whatever other mitigation measures are necessary once you've decided it is essential. So you've got an IT person who's the only person who can fix a specific problem that's happening at that office. There's nothing you can do but send that person, otherwise your operations will grind to a halt. So you've decided that's an essential piece of travel. Okay, well then you've got to put all the other plans in place, assuming India has opened the border and it can actually happen legally.
Yeah. Okay, I think
that may be where we are in a few months' time.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. So I think we're running sort of right up against it. So I'm going to ask one more question, and that will be on pregnant workers. So they've been told to shield for 13 weeks. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a particularly number of weeks. I'm not quite in touch with that. Katharine, you'll probably add to it. But what if when they come back to work, the transport's not brilliant, so that makes commuting worse? How do we deal with people that have got vulnerable workers such as that, where actually their place of work needs to be in work, so they can't work from home? How are they dealt with?
I think that's more of an HR question, actually. I think.
Yeah, and I think I've got a question. I've got an answer to that. My answer is you really do need to take occupational health advice on how you deal with things like that from your normal occupational health advisors. And there'll be a lot of specific issues. That's a general question. But you want to know, I've got a specific worker who she is in her X week of pregnancy. She's concerned about this. What should we do? Well, we need to speak to someone who's going to give some advice and follow that advice. That assumes you want to push her back. Well, you may just say, all of our pregnant people, we're going to put them at the end of the line for who we're going to bring back in. Maybe, unless they're desperately keen to come in.
Excellent. Right,
okay.
Katharine. Yeah.
So I mean, we'll have a look at the rest of the questions, and we'll do our best to that. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us. I think we might actually do a sort of almost like a Q&A webinar to follow up on this at some point, because I think there's a lot of questions. But I'd like to thank Simon once again for his input. It's been invaluable, yes, I think everybody, I hope this has been useful for you and has helped with your planning. We will have the webinar available on our website. And as I say, I will be releasing my document next week. Simon, can I put your document, a PDF of your document, on the website yet, or will that be coming out next week as well?
Next week, preferably.
Okay,
that'll be it's an article I've written which covers similar ground to the discussion today.
So I think we'll put those on next week as well. And really, I mean, we are doing some other webinars around sort of safety and ventilation and things with Posturite. So keep an eye on our webinars, and hopefully there'll be something to tempt you. And I'm hoping it's going to be a lovely weekend, and we can sit in our gardens and have our hour's walk and that type of thing without being washed away. So thank you very much. Keep safe, and we'll speak to you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katharine. Thanks, Simon.